All right.
Excellent. Well, welcome and good afternoon to everybody. My name is Boris Simmons. I should probably introduce myself first. And I am the director of the National Project for Excellence in Environmental Education. And basically, what this webinar is all about is that you participated in a Train the Trainer workshop, one or more of the Train the Trainer workshops related to the guidelines for excellence. And that now this is sort of the follow-up to give you a little bit of the background and history and all of that in order to have us move forward and have you become part of what we call the Guidelines Trainers Bureau, which I'll get into a bit more in a few minutes about what that means and the resources we have and all of that. But what I wanted to do, since I don't know all of you, or at least from just seeing a first name, I don't necessarily know all of you, is do a quick introduction around the room of, because it's a real small group. I think there's only like Lisa and maybe 3 or 4 other people. So if I could ask people to unmute themselves and just say, what's your name? And, some little short thing about who you are, where you work, that sort of thing. So
well, I can start. Can you hear me?
Please. Yes.
So this is Francesca, and I work at the Butterfly Pavilion in Westminster, Colorado. So I am a non-formal educator. And my first job in the United States was with Bora.
A long, long time ago.
A long, long time ago, yes.
Yes, in Illinois.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you, Francesca. So Beth, maybe?
Hi, this is Beth. I'm Beth Hansen, and Francesca and I have worked together, so small world. I'm at South Platte Park in Littleton, Colorado, and I'm both, I have taught math as a traditional educator, but have more experience in the informal arena.
Cool, thank you, welcome. And
thank you.
Martina, was that your name?
Oh, I just got a chat from Martina that she can't connect her phone, but
oh, okay.
She says, I'm Martina from the Children's Museum of Denver. I am the outdoor coordinator here at the museum and do the program and operations.
Excellent. Thank you, Martina, even if you're doing it through chat. Hopefully you can hear. I do understand. We totally understand the issues of the microphones and such. And Lisa, do you want to, I assume you know all of these people, but do you want to, for the record, give an introduction to yourself?
Sure, yeah. So I'm Lisa Edens. I'm the program coordinator for the Colorado Alliance for Environmental Education, and I've worked with CAEE for about 5.5 years. And then prior, I've worked for other, mostly only nonprofits, both small and large. But yeah, I've really been happy to learn more about the guidelines over the last several years.
Excellent, thank you. Well, thank you all, and for all of your efforts and your desire to learn more about the guidelines and potentially be able to share them with others out there. So our agenda for today, and I have a PowerPoint set up so that we can go through the agenda, but especially since it's such a small group, feel free to use the chat to ask questions. Lisa will monitor that and pass those on to me. Or if you have, just unmute yourself and ask your questions as we move along. So what we're going to do is, we've done our quick introductions. We're going to I'm going to open it up for some questions that you might have based on the workshop itself that you participated in. So about the guidelines for excellence or the workshop itself. Then I'm going to give you an overview of the guidelines for excellence publications and how they came about and all of that, a bit of that history and context of why we have the guidelines, and again, the kind of timeline of it all. And then we'll focus some time on being a member of the Guidelines Trainers Bureau and what that means, and particularly what are some of the resources that we have available to you if you do want to share the guidelines with others through presentations, workshops, or just informal sharing of them. So I guess one, I want to pause here, and did somebody else join us? Did I hear a chime?
Hi, Bora, it's Katie.
Oh, hi, Katie. Hello there. Say hi to the group.
Hello, everyone.
Hey, Katie.
Hi, Katie.
So here we are. You went through an all-day workshop that was focused on the non-formal guidelines. Do you have any questions or comments, things that you wanted to share about the guidelines themselves or the workshop?
Bora, I have a general question, if you don't mind. When
Sure.
was I trained with you on the community engagement guidelines with that was the last one put out. Was this
Right.
one in the context of the 6 guidelines? Was this the first one? I'm just curious.
No, it was that's an excellent question, and now you've given away some parts of the answers to a question I was going to ask the group later, but that's fine.
Apologies.
No, that's okay. That's okay. The non-formal guidelines were, out of the 6 that we have, they were number 4.
Okay.
So we had already developed 3 other sets. Then we had a bit of a pause, and I'll talk about that in a bit. And then we developed the non-formal guidelines, the early childhood, and then the community engagement guidelines.
Is there any plan to review this one anytime in the near future?
It depends on your definition of near. We probably will end up looking at a revision of the non-formal guidelines in probably about 2021. So we've just finished a revision of the K-12 EE guidelines, the learner ones, and we're just starting a revision process for the materials guidelines. And then and that'll be a 2-year process. And when we're done with that, then we'll move into the non-formal guidelines.
Okay. Thank you, because I have a question, but I will chat with you offline on this one.
Sure. Sounds good.
And Bora,
Yeah.
I was just going to say from Martina through the chat, she said, I thought the guidelines for excellence would be applicable to other programs here at the Children's Museum and would like to share this with other coordinators. They have a teaching kitchen and arts. That's what she wrote in.
Excellent. That's very exciting. That's very exciting. And, you know, my sort of general philosophy about the guidelines is that, you know, for each one of them, obviously we're looking very much towards environmental education. That's our primary audience for the guidelines. And some of them are structured more around environmental education or environmental literacy. But in general, things like the non-formal guidelines in particular, they're designed around a pretty standard or common program development cycle. So the notion of being able to share them with others who are interested in non-formal or informal education and developing programs of various types, my sense is that they're pretty shareable with those other audiences or potential users out there. But thank you. So I'm going to move forward into telling you a little bit about the guidelines and a bit about that background to them. One of the things that I always want to mention is that we have sponsors for the guidelines, the development of them, putting on workshops, all of the types of efforts to go around the guidelines for excellence. EE360 is our primary sponsor, and EE360 is a partnership between NAAEE, the North American Association for Environmental Education, and the US EPA Office of Environmental Education. EE360 is a 5-year cooperative agreement between EPA and NAAEE. NAAEE has other partners, like Earth Force is one of the partners, Project Learning Tree is a partner, Antioch University, New England is one of the partners, Stanford University is a partner, and the University of Oregon, which is where I'm based. We're all partners in EE360. But it is a 5-year cooperative agreement. We're just beginning our 3rd year of that cooperative agreement. Of course, each year depends on funding, and that depends on Congress. So, you know, we always cross our fingers and push heavily for funding to go into EPA's Office of Environmental Education. We have had a number of other really wonderful partners over the year, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, the various state and provincial EE associations. So like CAEE has been one of our really, really important partners from the very beginning, helping us develop materials, helping us do workshops. Katie, I'm going to go into mention this in a little bit. Katie is one of the people who's on our writing team to revise the materials guidelines. So we depend on our state and provincial EE associations so much for everything we do related to the guidelines. We've also had a lot of other organizational partners like Project Learning Tree and Wild and Wet and Arbor Day Foundation, Keep America Beautiful, and lots of other organizations out there. NAAEE, however, is the sort of owner of the Guidelines for Excellence. It is an initiative of NAAEE. It's one of the program areas. And just in case you don't know about NAAEE or a whole lot about it, I won't spend a bunch of time here. Basically, NAAEE is the professional association at the sort of national, international, North American level for environmental education. It is, you know, sort of akin to what CAEE does, but at that national North American level. We are all about advancing environmental literacy and civic engagement through education. So that's a really important thing to sort of keep in mind. And what we're doing with the guidelines is that we hope we're helping to advance our practice as environmental educators so that we can advance environmental literacy and civic engagement. Again, the state, regional, provincial affiliates are huge to environmental education. There are 56 at this point. So it's a big piece of what we do and how we do it as a professional organization. So the guidelines themselves, from the very beginning, we talked in terms of excellence, and we talked in terms of promoting excellence in environmental education. It's a lofty goal, but it really is an aspirational goal that we are going to help people be really excellent in everything they do related to environmental education and environmental education practice. So that's kind of, what we try to do with the guidelines. Now what I want to do is sort of jump in to this notion of an overview of the project itself, the 6 products, the 6 documents that we have, so that you sort of see the whole thing. So now I know that Francesca, at least, has, because she mentioned it in what she when she talked, that she's been to the non-formal EE program workshop, and I know that she participated in the community engagement workshop that was last year. And let me sort of get a quick, maybe you can use the chat and then Lisa can read them off to me, is that have you been, meaning Beth and Martina, have you been involved, been to a workshop somehow related to any of the other sets of the guidelines for excellence? So just sort of, yes, workshop on. So something really quick and dirty to say your previous experience with the guidelines. And I know it takes a moment to type things in.
Yeah, so Martina said, non-formal we have been together, I guess, but planning on attending the early childhood that Katie and I are planning for sometime in June, Bora. I think we had talked to you about that.
Yeah, you did. I love the early childhood guidelines.
And then Beth says, yes, was at the recent workshop with Lisa and Katie. So that I think she's referring to the non-formal.
Non-formal, cool. Okay, so that helps me because it sort of gives me a perspective of how much you've interacted with or used the different guidelines. As you can tell from this listing, there are 6 of these sets of guidelines. We have a bunch of other publications and materials that come along with them, but this is the core of what we do. And each one of these sets of guidelines sort of takes a different slice of the pie of what we do as professionals in environmental education. So instructional materials relating to the development of revision of instructional materials, activity guides, those sorts of things. The K-12 EE guidelines are in essence kind of our equivalent to the national standards for environmental education. They're all about the learner, the K-12 learner, and what we hope that what they know and are able to do. Professional development is about us. So it's about our competencies. And if you are involved with or learning anything about CAEE's certification program, the professional development guidelines are used as kind of the backbone for certification. Non-formal, you've participated in that workshop, so you know about it. Early childhood is exactly what it means, is that it's about the we ones. So it's about what do you think about when you're developing programs for those 2 3-year-olds up to about 6-year-olds. And then community engagement is really all about how do we as environmental educators work with others in our communities towards common issues, concerns, challenges. So one of the things about the guidelines, which I think is really, really critical, so in some ways, if you don't walk away with anything else, one of the things that messages I want to get across to you is this notion of that these sets of guidelines really try to articulate our collective wisdom about excellence in environmental education and about quality environmental education practice. And it's one of those things where, you know, some people don't like the idea or the term of best practices. There are other terms that are used, but basically these sets of guidelines were developed through a public participatory process. So literally thousands of people have been, individuals and organizations have been involved in the development of these guidelines. Basically, what we have always done is that we started with kind of surveying the literature in the field. So for something like the instructional materials guidelines, we sat about looking at, well, what did people say out there in the literature about what makes good quality instructional materials? What are the types of things that, you know, different groups, NSTA, curriculum developer organizations, practitioners, what did they say out there in the literature about what you need to make sure you've got in between, you know, the two covers, the cover and the back cover, that makes this good instructional materials. So once we had that sort of information gathered, we formed a writing team. We always try to have a writing team that's somewhere between around 8 and 14 people. It's in that range. We try to have people from across the country represented. And because it's kind of a small group of people, we often have people who have multiple hats. So just like, you know, you on this call is that, you know, somebody on the call has a really strong K-12 background, but has also, you know, may also have a really strong content background. Somebody else has worked a lot in not-for-profits, and somebody else has worked for government organizations. Somebody works for business, somebody works for, so that we make sure, you know, higher education, that we have a number of different types of perspectives on the writing team. The writing team looks at all of the background information, and then they start the process by kind of brainstorming, working together over a series of days of thinking about what is it that we want to boil this down to say, these are the important pieces to the puzzle that is instructional materials or non-formal program development. Then we take that first draft, which may only be 1 or 2 pages, 3 pages, and we send it out for review. And we gather comments back, we revise, send it out for review, comments, revise, send it out for review. And in the early days, it was all done through the mail. More recently, we post things up online, and we get comments you know, through email and other sort of electronic ways. But it's comments that are everything from big conceptual issues, big, you know, gaps that people recognize and submit to us, to things like, you know, you're using commas improperly, or, you know, you're overusing this particular word. So it's everything from editorial up to the huge, huge ideas. And so it's an iterative process going back and forth until we get to a point where we have very few of those big conceptual issues or gaps are being pointed out to us. And we're getting more and more and more of the purely editorial types of comments. Or we're getting comments that, for one reason or another, we had decided just really weren't, it wasn't a direction we wanted to go. So they might be recommending an additional piece of information or key characteristic or guideline, and it's just an area that we decided that we didn't want to go into because of the scope of and who we saw as being the primary audience. So that's really important, is that in trying to think about these guidelines, is that they really have gone through a pretty heavy vetting process. that I think allows them to sort of reflect that collective wisdom. Not to say that there aren't disagreements on how we should go about our practices, but I think that they do sort of capture a pretty good piece of what people think about environmental education. One of the other things that this process, and hopefully as you go about sharing the guidelines with others, whether you're sharing them, with people where you work or you're presenting them at a conference or an all-day workshop or half-day workshop, is that we found that both in doing that participation process of getting people's feedback and having them review things, that we were really engaging them in these sort of deep discussions about quality EE practice and what that meant. And then we also find that at the workshops, that's what happens. To me, the guidelines are important. Obviously, I think that the guidelines are important. I think that they serve an important function for environmental education. But a lot of what I think the true value is at those workshops, when you get 10, 20, 30, 40 people in a room looking at the guidelines and being able to talk about their own practice and hear other people talk about their practice and really start to, make good connections and questions about what they do, why they do, how they do it. So to me, that engaging is part of the collective wisdom. It's certainly part of how the guidelines came about, but it's also, I think, a big part of the power of the guidelines. And then our hope is that by developing these guidelines and really by engaging people in those deep discussions, that we're building EE as a profession, that people are starting to really see over these years of thinking about the guidelines and why we're doing them and how we're doing them and the what of them, that we're starting to say, this is who we are, and that we have a profession and we have a strong backbone to what we do, a strong foundation to what we do. Okay, so back to the guidelines themselves. So I'm going to ask you just a couple of questions, see if anybody has a quick answer to them. Francesca mentioned this, so if you were on the line and you were listening, what's the newest set of guidelines?
I'm not going to answer.
You're not going to answer? That puts poor Beth and Martina on the spot, which I will not do. But the newest set of guidelines is the community engagement guidelines. So when I put that list up, they're how I tend to think of the guidelines because I lived through the whole process. So the list was from the first set of guidelines to the most recent set of guidelines that we published, which are the community engagement guidelines. And then the bonus question, which I also won't torture you with, is that which set of guidelines was first developed, and that's the instructional materials guidelines. We're going to get into a bit of why we selected that set of guidelines, because it's part of our history and kind of the importance of how we got that set of 6 guidelines documents. So, and this is the problem of moving computers, which some of you don't know that I had to jump onto another computer. Ignore that question for a moment. So basically, just to give you kind of a timeline, how this all happened. We started this process in 1993 at the NAAE conference that was in Big Sky, Montana. So basically, it was October or November, and the board of directors was sitting there thinking about new directions for the field of environmental education and directions that we should be going in for NAAE. And one of the really big issues at that time, from basically the early 1980s and heavily in this 1993 sort of time, was the issue of education reform. Not to say that has gone away, or that it didn't exist before that, but there was a lot of discussion. At the national level, there were national mathematics standards for the very first time. Those were published in the late 1980s. Right around this 93 period of time, there were science education standards that were being developed. They had yet to be published. English language arts standards, civic standards, U.S. history standards. So, there was that whole national standards movement was really, really heavy. And so there was a question among the board members of, well, how should we be engaging that? Along with the idea of student standards, there was sort of another sense of saying, well, teachers, classroom teachers, shouldn't we have standards for classroom teachers? And so there was a beginning of a really huge discussion around teacher competencies and licensure requirements and all of that. So, and whether there should be tests and such for teachers. So basically at that meeting, there was a classic board resolution, to the executive director at the time, a man named Ed McCrae, was, you should do something about this, which is, Katie will enjoy that because that's pretty much what boards often do, is that they have great ideas and then point to the executive director and say, fix it. And that's in essence what happened. Ed McCrae and I were good friends. He called me up and basically asked me if I would sort of champion the process. So I spent the next 3-4 months and sort of came up with a work plan and sort of a process for how to go about addressing this big idea of EE and education reform, and that basically published something called the working papers that laid out sort of a process and a first step, second step, third step for this. And in essence, it's what became the guidelines for excellence. So in that process, we started with the materials guidelines, and that it goes back to that, developing the consensus, developing the public participatory process. All of that started in 1995, 96. So each set of guidelines has been developed pretty much using the exact same process. And so the materials guidelines were first published in 1996. They were followed by what we called the learner guidelines, the K-12 guidelines, shortly after that. Well, not too shortly after that, in 1999. They took a lot longer to develop. And then in 2000, the preparation and professional development guidelines, those ones that have to do with us as environmental educators. Now, I want to just mention that you would have thought with all my comments about national standards and the fact that there were science education standards and math standards and English language arts standards, that we would have started with the learner guidelines. But we didn't. Part of it was because we knew that the learner guidelines was going to be a much bigger project to do, and that it would take longer. And so we wanted to make sure we got something out early on. But the other reason was really important, that if you look back to what was happening in environmental education in the mid-1990s through the late 1990s in particular, but it keeps cropping up periodically, was that environmental education was under attack. We were under attack nationally, we were under attack locally. there was legislation in certain states that would ban environmental education from public schools, that would strip all funding away from environmental education. So there was a concerted effort by various people to basically say environmental education is bad. It's all about advocacy. It's all about inculcation. It's all about pushing an agenda uh, on young children, and that we were warping the minds of young children. And I'm not exaggerating in terms of the language that was being used. It really wasn't just sort of small issues around, the quality of some activity guide or, practice. It was truly at that sort of visceral level. There was actually an article published around this time that was, in essence, that environmental education was creating little green Nazis. And that was Little Green Nazis was in the title. So we decided that the materials guidelines was an important set of guidelines to start with, so that we could sort of put our line in the sand that said, no, environmental education is quality education, and that our materials should meet standards, and that we could come up with, or we did meet some of these standards. So we jumped in, spent a lot of time in developing these first 3 sets of guidelines, one after another, and then we paused for a bit in sort of in that 1999 to 2003 period of time to focus on training and implementation of the guidelines. So we were doing more and more workshops, because basically what we found was that publishing the guidelines themselves, that was great. It got them out there into people's hot little hands. We printed them off, we gave them out, we sold them a little bit, but mostly we gave them out with the support of US EPA. But that we found more and more that when we could gather people together in a room to talk about them, that training effort, that opportunity to discuss, led to people really understanding and engaging them better, and then being able to implement them in their own work. We also sort of started to have a little different focus. So most of the focus of the development of the guidelines was really about, here are things that you ought to think about if you want to develop instructional materials. That's what, kind of the purpose of the materials guidelines were. What should you be worried about? What should you think about when you're going to develop a new set of materials or adapt materials or whatever? So, and then the training fed along with that, but it's very much at that kind of individual level, maybe organizational level of, using the guidelines in your own practice, that kind of focus. We had a real shift around 2000 or so into thinking about, well, maybe these sets of guidelines can be used in some other ways to build the profession. And that's when we really started to talk about professional individual certification, and what that might look like and how to go about it, and those sorts of issues. And then we also started to work with something that was called NCATE at the time. Now it's called CAPE. And basically, it's a national organization that is involved with the accreditation of teacher education programs across the country. So those are, within colleges and universities. So we started to work with them about, well, how could we think about accrediting university programs that taught environmental education, and how can we use the guidelines as a basis for that? So that was that sort of 99, 2000 to 2003 was a pretty big shift in how we were thinking about the guidelines. As mentioned a little bit earlier from Francesca's question, 2004, we started, to get more questions about, well, what's next with the guidelines? Are there other topics? And a number of people were, asking around the idea of non-formal environmental education programs, and could we come up with a set of guidelines related to that? So those were published in 2004. We realized we needed more marketing and dissemination, and if you've seen anything about the adopt the guidelines piece, that's where it came out of, was in that sort of thinking about a dissemination plan and a marketing plan. And out of the dissemination and marketing plan was this idea of a Guidelines Trainers Bureau. So being able to actually think about how to maybe formalize it a little bit more, of trying to disseminate the guidelines, be able to offer more workshops and ways of sharing the guidelines out there. We also, spent a lot of time in there of revising and reprinting the guidelines, doing training, all of those kinds of things. And then about 2008, we decided that early childhood was an important area that we should get into in terms of the guidelines, that it was really a missing piece, that we had a lot of K-12, we had a lot of just general non-formal materials, those sorts of things that weren't necessarily age related or audience related, but early childhood was a growing area for environmental education, and that it was a good place for us to put some effort. So we started in 2008 and published the early childhood guidelines in 2010. 2014, so I told you back in 2000 was when we started to talk to NCAEE and think about accreditation and how we could work with colleges and universities to accredit their programs. We finally managed to be able to develop a program that we think works for accrediting colleges and universities, and our first programs were accredited in 2014. 2016, we published a series of workshop training modules. I'm going to show those to you in just a few minutes, because those will help you if you want to design workshops for others. We revised the early childhood guidelines and the professional development guidelines. And then in 2017, we published the community engagement guidelines. So that's the last set that has been published. That set took about 3 years to develop. So it was a considerable effort to develop that set of guidelines. Then we spent basically the last year and a half, 2 years, revising the K-12 environmental education guidelines. Those are the learner guidelines. And as I mentioned, we've just started the process to revise the materials guidelines. One of the things, so you are familiar with the non-formal guidelines, and I'm going to quickly go through a little bit more about each of the sets of guidelines, but just know that they're all kind of structured very similarly. So you understand, hopefully, the structure of the non-formal guidelines. If you picked up the material guidelines, or you picked up the community engagement guidelines or early childhood, you're going to see a very, very similar structure. So hopefully that will help you in trying to decode and find your way around the guidelines. But basically, for all of them, there's an introduction that sets up, what are these guidelines about, and a little bit about EE. But then there's the heart of the guidelines. They're all divided into what we call either key characteristics or strands or themes. They're the big ideas. So for the non-formal guidelines, there are 6 key characteristics. And so you work through, needs assessment, evaluation at the very end. You work through those key characteristics during the workshop. Each key characteristic is then divided up, further articulated by guidelines. And those guidelines basically kind of focus in on some piece of the puzzle that, when you put all of the guidelines together, sort of help you get to that key characteristic about, say, needs assessment. And then each of the guidelines is further sort of described by what we call indicators. And sometimes it says what to look for, or it has a different kind of tagline, but basically those bullet points that hopefully provide a bit more imagery about what we mean by the guidelines. So what are the types of things that you might be doing in your program development process that would get you to that guideline? What are the types of things that you would see when you open up an activity guide, an instructional activity guide, that would get you to that guideline? So the indicators aren't meant to be, everything and anything that you could possibly see or do. They're really meant to be exemplars. They're meant to be illustrations to provide that kind of imagery. We have boxes and examples in all of them. And for like the non-formal, since they were published originally in 2004, most of those boxes are out of date. And so that's part of the revision process, is to come up with new examples and better examples for each of the key characteristics. And then there's some sort of references in there. And sometimes there's appendices that provide other bits of information that are helpful. So that's kind of the overarching structure of any set of guidelines. So again, instructional materials, and I'm going to go through these pretty quickly just so you can kind of see what, how they're laid out, and then hopefully you'll be interested and pick up another set of guidelines, or go to one of CAEE's lovely workshops, so like early childhood, and I think there's a K-12 one that might be offered sometime later on. So instructional materials, there are 6 key characteristics that talk about the needs of those instructional materials, that they're fair, that they're accurate, that they really delve into concepts and skills building and help move the learner towards thinking about action and what's appropriate types of action. And of course, it talks about instructional soundness. So what are some of the types of things that we would hope to worry about in making it appropriate from an instructional perspective for the target learner, for the target setting? And then things that hopefully make the materials more usable so that they don't just sit on the shelf. So that's kind of quickly what the materials guidelines are really all about. The K-12 guidelines, I mentioned that those have been revised recently, just printed or being printed at the moment. They're divided into 4 strands. These are the same big idea strands as we had in the previous version, but underneath we've revised them some. We spent a lot of time taking a look at the next generation science standards and C3, which are the social studies standards and global competencies, looking at ocean literacy and climate literacy, and trying to make sure that we were really addressing those issues in how we developed this set of guidelines. The K-12 guidelines are what we call benchmarked. So they're basically divided into K4, 5th grade to 8th grade, and 9th through 12th grade, with that notion of, well, this is what you would hope a 4th grader would know and be able to do at the end of 4th grade, at the end of 8th grade, and when they graduate from high school. In developing these or in revising these, we also put on a really a much stronger lens around equity and inclusion, and we put a much stronger lens of thinking about sustainability issues. So we try to include those kinds of ideas throughout the guidelines. Professional development, again, if you've been involved with certification, you know this set of guidelines. It's 6 themes, and they basically all address different aspects of our professional development, our competencies as an environmental educator. So are we individually environmentally literate? Do we understand the foundations of environmental education and what makes EE different from and similar to other fields of education? What are our professional responsibilities? What are the important things that you need to worry about when you plan and implement programs? How do you go about fostering learning and promoting inclusivity? And what are our competencies in terms of assessment and evaluation? Non-formal, I'm not going to spend time here because you have already been involved with the non-formal guidelines in the workshop. Early childhood, the 5th set of guidelines. Again, quite different, set up in very much the same way of 6 key characteristics, guidelines, and indicators. But what's a little bit different with this set of guidelines, and you'll get into it if you have a chance to go to the workshop, is that they're really developed in some ways for 2 different audiences. So all the sets of guidelines are developed for environmental educators, people who practice environmental education. And our sense was, and what we were hearing from people out in the field, was that more and more often, environmental educators, especially non-formal environmental educators at zoos and museums and parks and, all of those sorts of places, were getting calls from daycare providers, preschools, and such saying, I've got a group of 3-year-olds and I'd love to bring them to your park. Or I'd love if you could come and do an environmental education program at our preschool. And environmental educators were like, well, that's great, and we love the idea, but I don't necessarily know a whole lot about 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds and what early childhood education is about compared to working with 5th, 6th, 7th graders or high schoolers or adults in a program. So that was one important audience for us, quite obviously. And then another important audience for us were those preschool, daycare, early childhood education providers, because we were also hearing that they were more and more interested in environmental education. They just didn't really kind of know where to start, other than maybe to invite somebody in or to take their kids to a place. So we try to kind of hit both of saying, if you want to have an early childhood EE program, these are the things that you need to think about, worry about, be concerned with. You need play and exploration. You need to worry about developmentally appropriate practices and research and all of those sorts of things. How you design the place, the space for this education is really important. And then finally, the community engagement guidelines. We've mentioned this before. They are our newest set of guidelines published in 2017. And we've been trying to disseminate them out there using workshops and other such things. And again, around key characteristics in this particular case, it's 5 key characteristics, saying that if you want to work with others in your community, other community-based organizations, individuals, that this effort, this type of effort, really needs to be community-centered, obviously, the parts that you bring to it as an environmental educator certainly should be based on sound environmental education principles, but it needs to be collaborative and inclusive, and hopefully that you're building towards some sort of bigger community capacity and civic action, and then really worrying about long-term investment in some sort of change in the community, that this isn't just sort of a one-off field day. It could be, but hopefully we're trying to encourage something that's going to be bigger and a bit more of a long-term commitment. So I'm going to pause here for just a moment and ask if there are any questions about all of that. I know it's just a huge amount of dump of information about the guidelines and how they were developed.
I'm looking at the chat and don't see anything so far, but feel free to chat questions in or unmute yourself.
This is Francesca. I don't have a question, I have a comment. I like that all throughout the guidelines there are some trends that go all throughout, but also that each one of them is different. So it's obvious that they are a collective production, but also it's obvious that there was attention to being specific when necessary. So I appreciate it.
Good, thank you. And one of the things with the revisions of the guidelines is that in updating them and all of that, we're also having the same person design them. So hopefully they won't look quite like, you know, the quilt of hodgepodge of different publications. So they'll have at least a little bit more of a feel that is common across them. Is there something else? Anything else?
Well, Beth just chatted in, not a question, but she was very interested that in the early days, EE was thought of as essentially propaganda. So that was interesting information to me as well, the green Nazis that you mentioned.
Yeah, and there was actually, and Katie may know more about this, there was an effort in Colorado. Colorado was one of the states that was targeted. So Arizona was targeted, and in fact, the state of Arizona disengaged itself. It had sponsored Project Learning Tree and Project Wild, what kind of was being developed at the time. The state had sponsored those and basically fired the people involved and sort of cut themselves off from Project Learning Tree and Project Wild. And then there was an effort to target through the legislature in Colorado and also through the legislature in Wisconsin. So kind of scary times for us in environmental ed. And there were, you know, other things going on at the national level.
Yep, indeed.
So I'm going to go on and talk a little bit about the Guidelines Trainers Bureau itself and what in the world that means, because that's why you're on this call. So basically there are about 120, 130 people who are members of the Guidelines Trainers Bureau. The vast majority of them are in the United States. We do have a few people in Canada, and we have one person who's in Abu Dhabi, I believe, but she originally was from Colorado and then moved to Abu Dhabi. So, you know, it's sort of, or Dubai, I can't remember quite exactly where she is. So most people are in the United States, and that's because primarily this has been funded through US EPA, and so our money kind of has to be spent for the most part in the United States. But basically, the Guidelines Trainers Bureau are individual environmental educators who are prepared to give presentations to a variety of audiences on the guidelines and how they can be used. That's kind of the simple about it. And our sense about prepared to give presentations is that we have a pretty broad notion of what we mean about how you know, as a member of the Guidelines Trainers Bureau, you know, what you might be doing. So you could be doing something like Katie and Lisa did, of offering a full day workshop to a variety of people. They might be a targeted audience, or might just be offered, you know, people in my county, people in the state, people in my region. Or it could be a presentation at conferences. It could be any sort of number of types of ways of sharing, including things like offering presentations or short workshops or little seminars, sharing circles, those kinds of things around the people that you work with. So we have a pretty broad notion of being a member of the Guidelines Trainers Bureau. We've got lots of people who are in higher education, and they don't necessarily do workshops for people outside of their colleges or universities. They use them within their classes that they teach. We do have lots of people who use them when they do staff development at their organization. And then there are others who periodically, for various reasons, offer workshops around, often in coordination with their state or regional provincial affiliates. So in coordination with groups like CAEE, being able to hopefully extend some of that reach for a statewide organization. So what I'm going to walk you through is that we have a number of training resources that are available for you. So if you want to do one of these workshops or a presentation on some aspect of the guidelines, we have lots of materials that are available to you. And I'm going to show you what they are and where you can find some of them. Spend maybe just a little bit of time having you think about planning workshops and other opportunities, and then just an opportunity to wrap all of this up with questions and clarifications. So first, I'm going to show you some of the pages that are up on the NAAEE website, so NAAEE.org. So the whole first part are all things that you can access if you just remember to go up to NAAEE. And then I'm going to show you some of the types of things that we have on a shared Google Drive. And after this webinar, if you send me your name and email address and say that, yep, I'm interested in formally being part of the Guidelines Trainers Bureau, because it's all up to you, then I will send you the link to that shared Google Drive so that you have access to it. Because otherwise, obviously, it's a private drive, but it's available to everybody who is part of the Guidelines Trainers Bureau. And then I also want to show you EE Pro, which is part of NAAE's efforts of trying to have people network and share information and expertise and a sounding board for what we do. And we have a Guidelines for Excellence group as part of EE Pro. So I'm going to show you that. Oops, what did I just do? So I just went backwards. I am going to exit out of this for a moment so that we can then go up to NAAE's website, and I can walk you basically through the resources that are available up online. Now, obviously, these resources are available to everybody. So, you know, somebody in Taiwan has access to all of this too. And that's a deliberate effort on our part, is that we want to make sure that the guidelines are as accessible as possible to anyone, anywhere. So that's been a deliberate thing from the very, very beginning with our work with NAAE and the guidelines and EPA. So this is the NAAE website. You can see that there's whole bunches of other stuff that you can get to. This is a way of getting to the EE Pro that I'm going to show you in a little bit. But if you go to our work, so the first tab, you can see a whole bunch of the different activities that NAA is involved with, including the conference. Call for presentation closes at the end of the month. Our conference is going to be in Lexington, Kentucky in October, and it is a phenomenal conference. So if you have a chance, you should really try to make it. It's a wonderful conference. But if you see here, one of the pages that you can go to off of our work is Guidelines for Excellence. So if you just click on that, and I'm going to go to a tab so we don't have to wait for loading, is that the Guidelines for Excellence just sort of provides some basic background about the Guidelines for Excellence, why we did it, how we did it, you know, some of that sort of stuff, basics about it. I would heavily recommend that if you're going to share about the guidelines, even if it's sort of a short and sweet sharing with staff, that you just kind of read through some of this to remind yourself about the guidelines. But you can also see that there are, I don't have the right vocabulary of what these are called. I would have called them tabs in a previous generation of online stuff. But basically, you can access all 6 of the guidelines here, and I'll show you that in a moment. There are those workshop resources, the modules here. There's a listing of who's on the Guidelines Trainers Bureau by state or province. There's, you know, information if your organization wants to adopt the guidelines. CAEE was one of the first organizations to adopt it. We've done some webinars on each of the sets of guidelines. Those are a little bit old, but they're still posted here, and you can, you know, take a look at them if they're of interest, if you just want to get kind of an overview of a set of the guidelines. And then for the previous version of the K-12 guidelines, we did these various documents that showed the articulation, showed the linkages between the K-12 environmental education guidelines and NGSS and the Common Core and C3 and the global competencies. And then we did the same thing with linking EE to the ocean literacy, climate literacy, and energy literacy principles that the federal government has put out. These are now out of date because they're based on the previous version of the guidelines, and we'll be updating them over time. But basically, if you were to look at these, what you would find is that there's pretty good convergence, you know, some really strong links between NGSS and the K-12 EE guidelines. They're even stronger now. So, and there are of course gaps because there are things that we don't do that science does, and there are things that science doesn't do that we do. So that's still there. We're working on trying to further develop that and update that. But what I want to show you here is that, so for the 6 sets of guidelines, so the non-formal, the materials, K-12, all of those guys, that we have them here all up online, and they're in PDFs. And you can, of course, purchase them. We like that because that's a good thing for NAA. Actually, NAA doesn't make any money off of it because these were all developed through federal funds. But they make their money back for when they printed them, and they obviously make money back for the shipping and handling costs. So it doesn't cost NAA anything, but it's not a profit center. But you could purchase them and get a hard copy that way. Or you can simply download them. So it's the PDF of, well, let me get to the new guys, the PDF of the K-12. So you could download the whole thing. I warn you, it's it's about 90 pages long. You don't want to hit print. But so this is one of the things that we did as soon as we had the ability to be able to post things online, is that we offered them in PDF form so that people didn't have to purchase them, so that they could access them electronically if that made the most sense. Earlier I mentioned that we also developed some modules. And what we did was that we, for each of the 5 sets, so up through early childhood, we have these one-day modules that are, we call them workshop resources. And let me see if that's the right, yep, that's the right page. So this is basically a document, again, PDF. You can download it for free. You can look at it. And basically it outlines a possible one-day workshop that you might want to do. Let me make this a little bit bigger, make sure you can see it. Is that on the non-formal guidelines. So it describes the workshop, it gives you a little bit of background. Here are some possible objectives, certainly for this one-day workshop. This is what you might need, or at least think about, including depending on the design that you worked out yourself. These are the handouts that you might have, and they're all included in this module. It gives you a sample agenda, and then goes into detail with time of how much you might spend on this particular icebreaker, on presenting about the background, different, doing a mini self-assessment, string theory. And one of the things is that you could look at this quite realistically and go, we didn't do that in our one-day workshop that Lisa and Katie did, and you bet. Our notion was that this is a resource that you can use if it makes sense to you. If it doesn't make sense to you, then develop, please, please, please develop the materials that are going to make sense given your audience, given your purposes and goals for that workshop, and how much time you have. So we have these 5, and we actually have a 6th for the community engagement guidelines, but we're kind of in the process of finalizing that and having it make sense. And eventually they'll get posted on the public part of the website. We also have workshop, all-day workshop outlines and materials for the community engagement guidelines, but they're in the shared drive. And I'm going to jump to the shared drive to be able to show you that piece.
Bora, there was just a quick question, if I could jump in.
You bet. Absolutely.
If someone said, do we need to be part of the Trainers Bureau in order to just share with or train our coworkers?
Absolutely not. You don't need to. I know lots and lots of university faculty members who use the guidelines one way or the other in their courses, and they are not part of the Guidelines Trainers Bureau. The piece that is a little bit different is that, so, all this material's up online. You've got physical copies or a copy of the guidelines. You can download things. You can use them in whatever way, share them in whatever ways that you want. And we absolutely bless you in doing that. Mm-hmm. We want them to be used. We want them to be shared. We want others to know that they're available for their own use and adaptation to their particular setting or use. So no, we don't sit there, and that's part of the reason why we have all this available up online, is that we want it to be accessible to anyone.
And so, Bora, if I could just put in a plug there, I think even if you don't become part of the Guidelines Trainers Bureau, one thing I would just encourage for the the good of the field would be if you are training coworkers or using the guidelines in other ways, I think we'd still like to know about it. And we can still count those numbers and really showcase how these guidelines are making an impact on the field.
Yeah, thank you, Katie, because that's absolutely right, is that, you know, we want others to know that we're doing this and that we're doing this work and that we have this huge network of people out there who are using the guidelines and sharing and feel value them enough to share them with others, because that's a really important indicator of success for us. So yes, if you would be willing that, you know, you decide that no, you don't really want to be part of the Guidelines Trainers Bureau because, you know, that's not where your linkage is and that's not where your efforts are going to be in life, and that's fine, because we all have lots to do on our plate, but you do want to share them with, say, your coworkers, or you want to include them in your staff development efforts. Please do shoot either me or shoot Katie an email that said, you know, I shared the non-formal guidelines with 5 other department heads. And that's just wonderful for us to be able to report. We report those numbers to EPA. That helps NAAE. It helps, you know, further funding for the Office of Environmental Education, to get kind of crass about it, but it's important for part of the funding efforts. And I should probably just do a quick mention that another project that we've just starting, like we haven't even had the first organizational meeting yet, that Katie's involved with, is that the Guidelines Trainers Bureau has always been sort of at the national level. But we have states like Colorado that have been heavily involved with the guidelines all along and heavily involved with training people in the guidelines and doing the hard work, putting on those workshops of the train the trainer piece. And so we're starting to work on how can we make it be sort of something that is tied more closely, sponsored by the affiliate, so that there would be kind of a CAEE Guidelines Trainers Bureau that then linked to the national level. And that's just a way of having it be more meaningful and help support the work of CAEE, as well as obviously supporting the work of the guidelines and NAAE. So that's something just to keep an eye on, is that, so if you're looking at this as, well, I'm not so sure about being part of something that is, you know, national North American, that's not what I do. I'm focused in my state, my region. Well, keep an eye out, because we're really going to be trying to build it as a much stronger effort within the various states and provinces. And CAEE and Katie are willing to be guinea pigs in our effort of trying to figure out what exactly that means.
And Bora, there's just a couple other comments and questions. One was a comment, I'm quite surprised about the level of trust in your listeners that they are able to transport the messages. I think she's talking about, that you're able to train people and you have trust that we're going to go out and convey the messages appropriately.
Well, yeah, and there is a fairly big leap of faith there. And what I will tell you is that I do trust people. I trust that, one, a lot of the people who are members of the Guideline Trainers Bureau were selected by or encouraged by people like Katie and Lisa in a state because they know them, or they're self-selected into this because they are so committed to environmental education. So there is sort of a sense that people who want to share this kind of information, people who want to give these sorts of presentations or workshops, that they're of a professional level, that they are able to follow through on these messages. But, sometimes I hear about or I see somebody who's talking about the guidelines in a way that it's like, ooh, well, that wasn't really the story, and that wasn't really the reason, and that's not how I would interpret them. And, if I find out about it or somebody else, tells me about it, then I try to have a personal conversation with them to sort of try to get people back on track. But, in reality, as I said, there's 120, 30 people out there across the country in North America. And I personally don't know what's going on when they give a presentation or a workshop necessarily. We do have evaluation forms, so I sometimes see those and I get a sense of if things seem to have gone off the rails a little, and then I go back and talk to people. But I don't necessarily, even from the evaluation forms, the question about messages and being kind of on target, I'm not going to get that from the evaluation form necessarily. I might get a little. So yeah, it is a piece of just trying to hope. There's a lot of hope in it. And what I will say is that putting up those one-day modules, those workshop resources that I mentioned, that I showed you, is that part of that was because I knew that there were, because you hear stories. I knew there were lots of people, higher education folks, but others at zoos and museums and nature centers and whatnot, who were putting on workshops and they weren't part of the Guidelines Trainers Bureau. They just picked up the guidelines, thought they were good, and then they designed their own stuff and they were presenting it. And so there was sort of a sense of like, well, maybe if we provide this as a basic resource, there are a bunch of activities, this will help people think about the process and dig a little deeper into it. And that way they'll be able to share them in perhaps a little better way. But, again, there's a lot of hope and faith, I will admit.
And just one final question from the participants today. Is listening to this webinar the only requirement of being a part of the Bureau?
Yeah, pretty much. Yes, it is at this point. And that's part of what the working group, the folks that Katie is going to be involved with, and Lisa is on that team too. And we're working with 4 states over this next year to talk about, and it's North Carolina, Kentucky, Colorado, and Oregon. And we're working with the affiliates in each of those, so the state association in each of those 4 states, to think about what does it mean to be a member of the Guidelines Trainers Bureau, and what does it mean for the state affiliate, that association, to be kind of the primary sponsor. And so, yeah, we are going to be kind of reflecting on, in essence, the job description and requirements and ongoing requirements and ongoing professional development. When we can, we encourage people, and sometimes we give a little bit of scholarship money for Guidelines Trainers Bureau members to come to the NAAE conference and be able to go to other sessions that relate to the guidelines, or learn new things, or talk to others about the guidelines, a bit of that sharing. I send out little emails like about 4 times a year that kind of say, this is what's new, to the people who are on the Guidelines Trainers Bureau list. But in reality, we don't have the bandwidth to sort of go and observe people. We don't have the bandwidth to do follow-up professional development with individuals spread out all over the country. So part of that, building it in at the state effort, is sort of hoping that, not that I would expect that Lisa and Katie are necessarily going to be going out and observing everybody, but that there's at least a bit of it's a shorter tether to the Colorado members of the Guidelines Trainers Bureau. So it is an issue, and it's one that we're hoping to try to address some. But yeah, the short answer is going to the workshop and doing some sort of follow-up, so like this webinar, is kind of what gets you in the door. And then hopefully from then, you develop. Any other questions or comments?
Francesca just chatted in. She's just looking at the NAAEE website and it is looking for the link for the example one-day workshop.
Oh, so if you go to the NAAEE.org/guidelines, so that page, let me see if I can
maybe chat it in here too.
Yeah, so if you go to the NAAEE website, go down to Guidelines for Excellence, you go to that page, go to Workshop Resources. So it's the second little box in. That gets you to the resources for each, again, the public site for all of those resources. And now what I'm gonna do is, just because I'm a little cognizant of time, is that I want to show you what's on the shared Google Drive, which is far, far more detailed. So there's a lot more resources on the shared Google Drive to help people, the members who are part of the Guidelines Trainers Bureau. So a little bit, I gave it a little bit of a short shrift in terms of what else do you have to, what else do you have to do to become a member of the Guidelines Trainers Bureau? Nope. Pretty much, check the box. But with these resources, what we hope is, and again, there's a lot of that hope that you're professional about what you do in life, that you would prepare. And that these resources, because they dive more deeply into agendas and activities and handouts and PowerPoints and all of those sorts of things, that these would really allow somebody to pull together a really good solid workshop or presentation on the guidelines. So just as if you get up to this, and again, just email me that you are interested in following through. I'll have your email address, and then I will send you the link to this, because obviously you can see that it's a shared drive. But basically up here, there's all sorts of stuff. Now, so like here's a background flyer, that, and obviously you can download this. Everything's either in Word or in PDF or PowerPoint. So this is just like a one-pager that does a little bit of the history, that lists off the six and gives the URL. So it's something that if you were doing just a quick and dirty presentation, or you were sharing it, like maybe you had a funder that you wanted to go talk to, and you wanted to say that, oh, we're linked to this project, and EE has real guts to it, and you might want to hand out the background flyer. Not really sure about that. The implementation flyer talks about each of the sets of guidelines and what are things that you might do to implement that set of guidelines. So for the non-formal, you might review your existing programs, plan a new program, review current programming, your process that you go through and think about that process, or you might want to share it with others. So for each one of these, it's just some ideas of ways that you might use it. I hand this flyer out at workshops sometimes, just so that people have that sort of sense of different things that I can, now that I have the materials guidelines in my hot little hands, what could I do with them? For you folks, I would never, well, never is probably a bad word to use. I would rarely ever hand this out to people, but it's just a short little history, and that might be the type of thing that could remind you if you were going to go into a meeting or go into sharing it or something, that just sort of remind you a little about it. And it gets to message to some extent. I mentioned that, those early working papers that I wrote back in 1995, they're published up here. So that, you just have them as something that you can access should you, for some reason or another, want to look at that kind of stuff. So on this shared drive, we've got obviously the background information that I just showed you, but we have a tab or a folder for each of the sets of guidelines. So materials, the K-12, professional development, non-formal, early childhood, and community engagement. Each of these, for the most part, the folders are set up the same way in terms of what you have available to you that you can access. We also have folders that some sample all-day workshops, because sometimes you do an all-day workshop that is a combination of, say, the materials guidelines in professional development, or you're working primarily with formal educators, so you might do something that's early childhood in K-12, or you might do, whatever combinations. So all-day workshops of various types, samples are up here. So you can see some of them are titled kind of, in strange ways. Here's some stuff that CAEE had done. Alberta, we had a series of workshops up in Alberta, Canada, and so posted some of the materials here. All-day materials, did an all-day workshop for Angie, which is the New Jersey group. So just basically various samples of all-day workshops that have been done out there, as well as the modules that are posted up on the website. They're here too, so you can easily access them. Background articles, some sample flyers. We don't have very many sample flyers. We really need more sample flyers. This is a simple one or little Word document that talks about the planning process for doing a workshop. So what are some of the, here are the workshop, or I'm sorry, here are the sets of guidelines that you might choose from, a little bit of the history of the project itself. Here's where you can find a little more information getting started, and then kind of a checklist of things that you might want to think about. This piece is also available up on the NAA website on that tab that had to do with the modules, the all-day workshops. So it was just sort of trying to help people, be on message and get themselves organized and think a little bit about what they do. So those are some of the types of resources that we have. I wanted to jump into the non-formal tab here just because that's the common set of guidelines that you all have been through that workshop, to see what's available up here that you will have access to. So we've developed over the years various sample agendas. So a sample agenda for a 45-minute presentation. That's your classic conference dog and pony show kind of presentation. If you have a 90-minute period of time at a conference, or maybe it's it's at the end of a meeting, or at that, something along those lines, a 2-hour workshop, a 4 to 5 hour workshop. So various links of workshops, and then of course there's the all-day modules too. So there's different agendas. Some of the agendas are pretty quick and dirty, so it's just, this is what you're going to need. You're going to want to give 15 minutes on this, then you're going to do this, and here's the, wrap up in 5 minutes. So they, but they sort of outline a flow. They outline what you might want to try to do with your workshop. We also, this little flyer, not flyer, handout, it's not a handout because you wouldn't give it to people, but there's sample workshop objectives So the whole notion for all of this is that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. If you want to use these objectives, go for it. If you, because of whoever you were talking to, whatever you were talking about, you only wanted to do this objective there, that's great, that's fine. If you looked at these and went, nah, that's not appropriate for anything that I want to do, that's fine too, write your own. So none of this is cookie cutter. None of this is like, you got to do it. It's all really about trying to make the most sense for you and what you want to do. So that's the sample agendas. But then to go the next step, because the sample agenda might mention something like doing so I don't know if you did this in your workshop or not. I often do it. As I have people at some point in the non-formal workshop to do a self-assessment. Sometimes I use it as a pre-assessment before the workshop. Sometimes I do it as a post. Sometimes I do it as a homework, take it back home with you and think about it, reflection piece. But so this is here, it's mentioned in some of the write-ups for some of the agendas, and it's available so that, again, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can just access it, print it off, and it's obviously not showing properly in this view. But since it's in Word, you can, change it to have it make sense for your setting. You can localize it. You can do whatever makes the most sense so that it fits your needs. One of the activities that I do when I do the non-formal guidelines is I do a whole activity around who an audience might be for non-formal programming, and how do you know anything about that particular audience. And so this little handout sort of explains to the participants in the workshop what they might do, and helps you think about what you're going to ask them to do. So the first part here is your instructions as the workshop facilitator, the materials you're going to need, and then in this activity there are these little case studies that you ask people to do, and obviously some of the formatting's off again in this view. And then here's a little handout worksheet that you might ask them to do. So basically, up on, in this, in this shared drive, you have agendas that sort of detail out what you might do for different levels of workshops. You've got, sort of fleshing that out a little bit. Here are some of the activities that you might do and how you'd go about them, and any handouts that go along with it. Then, because, one stop, here's, the non-formal guidelines reprint, in PDF. So if you all of a sudden get there and go, oh my, I need that page and I didn't have that page with me, you can download it, or you can have people go up on their devices and look at the PDF, whatever. We also, I didn't mention this before, the non-formal guidelines are translated into Spanish. So the PDF of that are available. We've also translated the materials guidelines into Spanish, and that PDF is available up online. And then some folks in North Carolina who work with AmeriCorps took the non-formal guidelines and they kind of simplified them. And they kind of rejiggered them a little bit, translated them for the AmeriCorps audience. So basically use the same stuff. They talk about it in terms of steps, that's fine. But it makes sense. So that's actually what they use in their programs. Here's that module that's posted up online. So you have available here in both Word as well as PDF. So if you want one of the handouts that's in Word, you can get to it and you can rejigger it for your purposes. PowerPoint that is available. So if you want to, give one of your presentations to staff, to others, do a workshop, you have a PowerPoint that you can then download, adapt to your particular time that you have, your messages, all of that. And part of that does go back to that question about messages of Guidelines Trainers Bureau, is that I would hope, I mean, again, you can't control people, what they might do after they get out into the wild, but, is that if somebody was serious and professional about what they were doing, and they went up here and looked at the agenda and came up with their agenda that made the most sense, and the activities and the handouts given their audience an amount of time, and then looked at the PowerPoint and then did a little bit of that homework of looking at the history and reminding themselves that they should be fairly well on target about the big messages. And then, of course, everybody has their own messages, which is really important, is that the ones that make sense for their organization and their mission and their audience and such. So for each of the sets of guidelines, so materials, K-12, professional development, early childhood, community engagement, we have similar types of things that have been developed, sample agendas, the handouts, you can get to the PDFs, the module in Word and PDF, and then various PowerPoints that we've developed. So all of these are available. We do, because it's a shared drive, this is another one of those, leap of faith. I'm big into leaps of faith, is that if you come up here, please don't delete anything, because then it gets deleted and it's gone for everybody. Please don't change anything that is basic that's been posted. If you want to adapt it to your use, that's absolutely great. Call it a new name, so a new file name, and then adapt it, change it, do all sorts of wonderful things, and then share it back. So post it again so that other people can learn from it. So you do have the ability to edit up here, which means you can download and you can change things, but we do sort of please not destroy it for others, which with my technology, I'm sensitive to that because I could just see myself causing problems. So that's basically the resources that are available. And oops, I do want to show you one more thing before I move on and ask questions, let you ask more questions, is that up on the NEE website, there's something called EE Pro. And if you do nothing else, so if you don't become a member of the Guidelines Trainers Bureau, that's fine. Go visit EE Pro and root around and see all of the wonderful stuff here. So I'm going to come back for a moment of what the groups are, but there's a tab for learning. People post webinars, courses, workshops, all sorts of things up here. So there's all sorts of wonderful things that people post, conferences and such. Jobs, should you be in the market or you are trying to hire somebody new, you can post job announcements. Various blogs that people write about topics, which is really nice. Calendar and other opportunities, I'll admit that I'm not as familiar with those because I don't use them. Resources, people post their activity guides, their books, the guidelines are posted through this, all sorts of different resources that people have, they post through here. And then the research tab has wonderful, wonderful, wonderful access into and sort of interpretation of some of the research in environmental ed. Well worth some time investigating. But one of the main reasons why I brought you to the EE Pro part is the groups section, which is that we've got these various groups that are up here. EE Pro is really all about trying to network, trying to share, have a platform for being able to share information, but also just being able to say, hey, I did this great thing, I want to share it, or I have a workshop coming up and I'm really confused about this, or what are you folks doing in terms of strategic planning, or what are you folks doing about whatever. So it's an opportunity for people to ask questions, share information, get feedback. And we have a whole variety of different groups that are focused on some of these topics. So JEEP is a global EE, so it's all about things that are happening in New Zealand and Taiwan and various other parts of the world. There's one that's about advocacy, policy, and civic engagement. So it's a lot of the stuff that's happening in terms of policy and trying to advocate for environmental education within Congress. But it's also about civic engagement and how do we involve people, and what are the types of things that EE can do in terms of promoting democracy. There is a group that is focused on those affiliates and the affiliate networks, the state and provincial regional organizations, climate change, connecting to nature, conservation, higher education, K-12, sustainable cities. So, you can see there's lots and lots of these different early childhood EE. So lots of different groups. Well, there's one that's for the Guidelines for Excellence. It's not limited to people who are part of the Guidelines Trainers Bureau. Anybody who is an EE Pro, which basically means anybody who signs in, creates a profile on EE Pro, can become a member. You can be a member of any one of those groups. It's all for free. You can pick one or be a member of all of them. You get basically an email message on occasion when something has been posted in your or relates to your group and tells you that this is what's happening, and then you can read it or delete or follow the link. You can tell the system how often you want those emails. So you want them daily, weekly, monthly, all of that, so you don't get inundated. So this is the Guidelines for Excellence group, a EE Pro group. Some of you may know Sarah Johnson from Colorado is one of the moderators. Renee's from North Carolina, and I'm a moderator of this group. We get people to write little blogs about how they've used things. So UC, which is the Utah Society for Environmental Education, they were trying to do some strategic planning around their state. So they were doing these forums and listening sessions, and they actually used the community engagement guidelines to help them sort of formulate their questions for those groups. So I heard about that. I asked them, could they just write a short little paragraph to, let other people know that, well, there are other ways of using things like the guidelines, so the community engagement guidelines. So we get postings up there, little blogs about how people are using them, or different ways or issues around the guidelines. And then another option is to post or respond to these sort of discussions. So here's something that Sarah was going to be doing a poster session on one of the sets of guidelines, on the community engagement guidelines. And so she had sort of drafted up, what that poster might look like. And then she said, hey folks, what do you think about that? Can you give me some feedback? And you can see that 7 people responded with their feedback, and there were over 100 people who read those postings. And so it's just, different things, how do you use guidelines in college classrooms? So that was another posting that Renee put up there. But you might, as you were to go about sharing or go about using the guidelines, you might post something and say, well, have any of you done this? What have you thought about that? Or share, I used this in my program planning and this is how it worked, and here are the problems I had. So it's just a really, really great way of trying to connect people, you know, who aren't connected necessarily, and be able to share good quality information. So that does me for this piece. And since given our amount of time, as you think about being a member of the Guidelines Trainers Bureau, and let me go to oops, and we go off of that again. Sorry about this. Is that, you know, you're going to want to sit down. An important question is going to be your capacity and your time and your resources and efforts and all of that. But, you know, who do you want to share these guidelines with? Why? What's the focus? Which set of guidelines do you want to share? Where and when, and all those, and, you know, length of time and all of those kinds of things all come into it. And I'm sure that as you start this process and think about it, you're going to have questions. So if you want to bounce agendas off of somebody, if you want to think about how to sort of organize something, who the audience would be, how long it might take to do a particular type of presentation or workshops, please feel free to email me. And I'm more than happy to, you know, hop on the phone or to, you know, email back and forth and share agendas and think about how you might be able to sort of pull something together. And I'm thinking that probably, especially if it relates to the work of CAEE in one way or another, that you would be able to bounce some of that off of Lisa and Katie also, because they don't have enough to do. But it's also, you know, useful to be able to think about those sorts of things with somebody else. So before or as you sort of formulate your final questions here, I just do want to mention is that, so we've got these online resources. We have the shared files on the Google Drive, so that's available. You have human resources, so I'm available to try to help answer your questions or work through things, interpretations, PowerPoints, any of that you might want, you know, some assistance with. So all those pieces are available. If you're going to do a workshop, we do ask you to, you know, to report it, let us know so that we can report those numbers. If it's a workshop that lasts for 2 hours or more, we hope that you do some sort of evaluation and you share those evaluation results for us, because again, we have to sort of synthesize those evaluation results and report that to EE 360 and the EPA. And then finally, another resource that is available to you is that if you are doing a workshop that is a substantial workshop, so not a walk and talk, not a, you know, just a quickie little, you know, short presentation, but something that's, say, about 2 hours or more, and you would like copies of the guidelines for participants for them to take away, like you did with the non-formal, let me know. And if we have sufficient copies of them, because, you know, it costs money and all that, I will do my very best to get you copies of them for free. Sometimes you can charge for a workshop, and then that way you can buy them and then give them out to the participants. I do kind of avoid giving out copies of the guidelines for free for college classes. I did higher education for a very, very long time, and my sense is that students are used to buying textbooks, so if you're using it as a textbook, or they're also really used to looking at things in PDF and that's normal for them. So I tend to sort of say use one of those options rather than us giving out a precious resource for free to college classes. But otherwise, if you're doing a workshop in an area, say you're working with the teachers at a school or a school district, and you want copies of something, let me know and I will do my best to get you copies. So with that, final questions or comments?
There is a question here from Martina. She's just asking, what if I would like to present early childhood, although I've only participated in the non-formal workshop? What if I'd like to try to combine both for our company's use? Is that okay, even though she hasn't attended an early childhood workshop yet?
Yep, that's fine. You know, there are 6 sets of the guidelines, and lots of people who are members of the Guidelines Trainers Bureau have only been to a workshop on, you know, say 3 or 4 of them. That's pretty typical. Or they went to an all-day workshop that touched on 3 of them. So my sense is that, you know, you would need to do more, you know, homework of reading through carefully the early childhood guidelines so that you kind of knew them well before you did that kind of sharing workshop for your folks at the museum. But yes, you feel free.
Great. That was the only question I saw in the chat so far. That sounds
Okay.
Bora, I have a question for you. I sent 2 private chat requests to you. Did you see them?
I have not seen them because I can't see the chat
Okay.
right now. I will try to look at them before I sign out of this thing.
Okay.
But I will admit that, you know, I'm not necessarily that facile with Zoom, so I may screw up. In which case, if it's a question that you want me to respond to and you don't see a response, email me.
Okay, that's fine. And it's not a big deal. Just, yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
That's great. And my email, by the way, because I managed to realize that I don't have this up here on a slide, is simply borasimmons@gmail.com. So it's B as in Barbara, but it's Bora. BORAS like Sam, AIMMONS @gmail.com. So borasimmons@gmail.com. If you're interested in becoming an official member of the Guidelines Trainers Bureau, shoot me an email and say that you are, and that's great. I will do that, and then again, I will reciprocate with the link to those Google Drive resources. Anything else for the good of the cause? It's a good cause. CAEE is a really good cause. NAA is a really good cause.
Oh.
So thank you.
Thank you, Bora.
Thank you, Bora.
Yeah, thank you, folks.